compression and dynamic range. So really, we want to try and reduce the difference between the loudest part of the track and the quietest part of the track. And of course, we can do this by manually editing the gain. We looked at this right back in the first chapter, and you can actually get in there and use some automation to make things a little bit more uniform by reducing the volume in the louder parts and increasing it in the quieter parts. But if you've done the right job in the mix and you've been pretty careful and you've adjusted the level correctly and your relative mix is solid, you should have a fairly good dynamic range and dynamic signature now that hasn't got any real problems. If we look at the master that we're working with here, it's pretty good. Obviously our breakdown's quieter, and we can see we've got a quieter section at the beginning here in the intro drums. I'll just play this back. Obviously this is a little quieter than the bit where the bass comes in, because the bass is low frequency energy. And the breakdown is obviously a little quieter as well, because we haven't really got any instruments present. But we do really want to try and iron out the slight differences without smashing the hell out of the dynamic range. And we do that by applying bus compression. I'm going to talk about two things in this tutorial: bus compression and what I like to call cascaded compression. And cascaded compression is essentially using more than one compressor in your mastering chain. And we'll look at why that's useful and important in a second. But first of all, let's think about basic bus compression. Now in Reason, right on the mixer, we've got this SSL modeled bus compressor right here, master channel compressor. And just by activating this, we can start to reduce the dynamic range and apply a bit of gain reduction. Now, because we're mastering, we really want to keep things nice and transparent. So we want to keep the attack and release fairly slow. I would stay away from the auto release and just keep it on the slowest setting. And a nice minimal ratio, so 2:1 will be fine. And I like to apply around about, say, 3 dB of gain reduction, no more than 4 certainly at the loudest parts. And then what you should find is that when you go back and you play it at the quieter sections, you're getting very, very small amounts of gain reduction. So this is allowing 2 or 3 dB of volume to come through, of level to come through in these quieter sections. When things kick back in, you really shouldn't hear it. Now, this is, like I say, modeled on SSL bus compressors, and they're renowned for being transparent. They're renowned for doing a great job at exactly this, and that's why it is strapped across the whole master channel, because it's very capable of supplying gain reduction and reduction of dynamic range without pumping artifacts and without, really being able to hear it doing its job. With that applied, you would think, well, that's enough. We don't really need to apply any more compression. In this case, that might be true. But in other situations, you might find that applying 2 or 3 decibels of gain reduction with the bus compressor might not be enough. And you might find that, you need to apply more compression. Now, of course, you could raise the ratio, decrease the threshold of the bus compressor, and say maybe get 6 decibels of gain reduction. So we could go to, but you can start to hear it, and it's not conducive, it's not right for mastering. So ideally you want to keep the compressor at 2 or 3 dB. So how do you apply more compression? Well, you'd add another compressor later in the mastering chain. And in this case, there's nothing activated right now, but we could activate our compressor and add another 2 or 3 decibels of gain reduction, well, or another 2 decibels of gain reduction with similar settings. Now you should find that this sort of treatment using 2 compressors gives you a more transparent result. Let's keep it playing back. And you can see that there's not really a massive amount of change to the overall sound. I'm not sure that this actually needs this extra compression, but just to show you, we can apply really 2 or 3 decibels without affecting the dynamics of the track too much. And obviously using a fully featured compressor like this gives us a lot of control. We can control the input stage and the output stage very easily. We can have nice long attack and release stages. And this isn't the only compressor we can use. Of course, this is the M class, but we can use one of the rack extensions. And a nice one is the Decam bus compressor. And this is specifically for mastering and specifically for this sort of job. And you'll notice it's got very similar controls to the compressors we're used to, but it's got a very simple ratio control, which is more similar to the SSL bus compressor. So what this gives us is a compressor that's similar to the SSL bus compressor, but in the rack, which is very useful because we can apply this sort of cascaded compression. Let me just make sure that this is in. There we go. Now I'm just going to apply very small amounts. And the nice long release again. One mastering engineer once said, and I don't remember exactly who, he said, give me a compressor with a release, with an attack time of forever and a release time of forever, and I'll be happy. So long attack and release times are perfect for mastering. You get that transparent result. So there we go, 2 cascaded bus compressors. And of course, if you find you're getting artifacts, there's a mix control on this as well. So we can mix some of the dry signal back in, essentially giving us a slight parallel compression effect. And that's without anything else applied right up until now. Let's just make sure the maximizer's disengaged here. It wasn't actually creating any gain reduction. So with 2 compressors at this sort of setting, we've still got a nice transparent effect, and that's cascaded compression. So bus compression and cascaded compression, very useful in our mastering chain. Next up, I'm going to show you a trick for increasing density and reducing dynamic range in a similar way, but using a different technique and using parallel channels. If you require a little bit more density in your final master and some pretty extreme reduction in dynamic range, then you can, of course, add compression. And we've looked at bus compression and we have looked at parallel compression. We've also looked at cascaded compression, where you can add more than one compressor. And all of these tricks can be used to reduce dynamic range, and in conjunction with our final limiter, which we're going to come to shortly, you're going to be able to smash the hell out of your masters if you really want to, and also control dynamics and solve problems. But there are a couple of other tricks we can use to reduce the dynamic range without even touching a compressor. And one of these is using parallel channels. Now, so far we've looked at parallel channels quite a few times across the course of the course, but it's the first time we're going to look at it when it comes to mastering. So essentially, the process is the same, but the techniques we're going to use are slightly different. Back before parallel processing was introduced in Reason, we would have had to have copied the track. So we would have had to have made a new audio channel, and we would have had to have copied the entire thing and duplicated it. Now, this is fine, but it did cause a few problems in that you would get the occasional phase issue. And, it's not ideal because you're running multiple audio tracks and you'd have to run multiple effects and everything else. The new way is much slicker. We can go straight to the mixer. We can find the channel that we want. And we can click anywhere here and we just go straight down to create parallel channel. Now, again, we're going to see them indented straight away. Now, remember, this indentation here is the thing that signals them being and points to the fact that they are parallel channels. Now, I want to mix down the parallel that we've got. And remember, the whole thing is going through mastering processes. So we might want to switch some of these off. Let's just make sure we're at the rack. I'm going to switch off the EQ. In fact, let's bypass the whole lot. And we'll go back to the mixer, and then we can apply compression to each one of these as we see fit. I'm going to leave the bus compressor on, but we're going to make sure it's pretty subtle. Now let's play things back. We'll go back to our sequencer. And now what we can do is we can go to the rack of this new parallel channel, open up the object here, show insert effects, and we can now start to apply some pretty extreme processing directly to this. And I'm going to use this decam bus comp here. And let's dial in a fair amount of compression. And I'm not going to mix it. We'll add some saturation as well. And we'll increase the attack and release times. Now we've probably got about 8 or 9 decibels of reduction there, so a fair amount of reduction. And now I'm mixing it in. And this is our smashed version here. We can probably up the output gain a touch. And the good thing about the decam is that you can see the input and the output here, and you can pretty much match them. Which is quite a nice feature. And we're going to get a pretty full sound from mixing these two together. And that in itself is going to reduce dynamic range. And we can mix in as much of this compressed channel as we want. And it gives us much more control than simply adding a compressor directly to the entire bus, just in the same way as we have more control using parallel processing in the mixing stage. We have more control in the mastering stage as well. And it's not just compression, but we can go ahead and start to add another parallel channel. And on this one, we can maybe go ahead and add some deep EQ. So let's choose an EQ. And I'm going to go with the Trident A range here. So now we've got our low frequency EQ ready to go. We can start to choose the frequency that we want to add. And I'm going to add everything below 100 Hertz here. I'm going to make sure everything else is zeroed out. Then we've got a dirty low end signal going on here. We'll leave the high passes out of it. And I've just got an extreme amount of low end added there, which doesn't sound great by itself, but in the mix. And ensure that, you're not blowing the master level too much. And there's our original. So we've got our compressed and our low end. And this is a trick that mastering engineers have used for quite a while for increasing the density of a mix and still allowing plenty of control. So now if we go back to the rack, we can now start to apply the rest of the mastering. Let's just make sure that we're in a section where it's playing back. And we can apply our EQ and our compression if needed. Great, so you can start to treat it just like any other master once you've got all this together. And you can add as many of these parallel channels as you want. It's not going to be perfect for every mastering session, but it's definitely an option to you to decrease dynamic range and to get that super dense master if that's what you're after. Next up, let's take a closer look at mastering EQ and see what the stock processors have got versus some of the rack extensions and whereabouts in the mastering chain we should be applying this process. When it comes to EQing your master, you've got to be pretty careful. You've got to make sure that your movements are subtle and that you use large, broad brush strokes so that you don't colour things too much. Now, the EQs in Reason are pretty much designed for this, especially the M class, but we've not got as much choice here as we did have with, say, the dynamics processors or saturation processors. and there's not a huge amount of EQs that we can use in the master bus. I'm sure this will change as the library of rack extensions continues to grow and develop, but for now we've really got a few that we can focus on. The main EQ that we'd probably use in the mastering chain is the M-class equalizer, and it's been around for a while, but it works very well, and you know, it's pretty much designed with mastering in mind. You can tell this by the fact that the controls are very simple, and you know, you've got only a few bands you can choose from, and also there's this dedicated low cut, which is a dead giveaway really. And 30 Hertz is a great place to cut because it gets rid of any really unwanted subsonics. Remember, if you want to take a look at what's going on, I'm going to mute these parallel channels for the second, so we're just working with one. But if you want to look at what's going on with your master, you can always use the analyzer in the console. I wouldn't suggest using this EQ as a mastering EQ really. It's more of a tracking EQ, and it's a console EQ. Don't completely write it off, but it's perhaps best to stick to the ones in the rack. But we can see here there's some subsonics, and remember this is pre-filter in the rack, so we know that if we filter around 30 Hertz, we're going to get rid of some of this subsonic information. We can also see that there's a bit of a dip here at around 400 Hertz, and we could do with a bit more air at the top. So it's a good tool to use the analyzer. But moving back to the rack, let's take a look at what EQs we can really use. Well, like I say, the M-class equalizer is perfect, and we can add these areas that were lacking slightly at 400 Hertz. We can use nice low cue points, and like I was saying before, it's important that you keep things transparent and you use large brush strokes, keep cue points low, keep amounts of gain low, and generally just don't go too over the top. And if you don't need to add EQ, don't add it. You know, I'm going to keep this playing, but realistically, you should have really sorted most of this in the mix. Mastering shouldn't require too much equalization, you know, touches of air, touches of bass. But if you're adding more than about 2 or 3 decibels, you really need to ask yourself, why am I doing this? Am I trying to solve a problem that could be fixed in the mix? If that's the case, go back. Really, just step back and fix it in the mix, as opposed to adding a lot of processing here. Moving on from the M-class, we've got the U-bit Q from Yuhi, which is really nice. More of a sort of vintage style EQ, but a bit like a Pultec, but it's got a cut itself here, and we can cut right up to 230 Hertz. But the 24 Hertz is quite a nice place to cut, and it's got high pass cut as well if you really needed to cut the high end. Low pass. And we've got a really cool bottom end enhancer EQ band here, which we could use at about 90 Hertz to enhance the low end. And then we can choose the frequencies with these 2 bands here. So we've got a high shelf if we wanted to add a little bit of air. So it's a really cool EQ. Now, if you want a more extreme high pass filter, it can be done. And I'm going to show you how right now. You can actually use the stereo imager as a high pass. And the way this is done is that this is a splitter between 2 different frequencies in this stereo imager, this frequency band here. And it allows you to add or remove stereo information from either band. But if you solo the high band, you can actually, let's just make sure it's engaged. And you really want this original, so you're not enhancing anything. But you can sweep right from 100 Hertz upwards. So if for any reason you were doing some parallel processing in your master and you needed to take a lot of bottom end off one of the parallel channels, you can do it this way. And this is great to use in mixing as well, so a bit of a trick for you there. But these are really the equalizers you're going to be using. There are some graphic EQs that you might want to look into in the rack extension shop, but These would be the ones I would trust, just because you know they're going to be pretty clean and they're going to have a great signal path and not, destroy anything in your audio. So maybe stick to these for a jump off point. And remember, Q points low, gain amounts of gain low, and really if you're adding too much EQ or adding EQ in an area where you don't think you should be, think about the mix and maybe go back and fix it. Hopefully this has helped you understand EQ in mastering a little more. Go easy. And next up, we're going to take a look at width and space. If you really have to add stereo enhancement to your master, and it's not always something I like to do, because I feel that you really should have enough stereo image in your master already from the work you've done in the mix. But if you feel you really have to do it, then there are a couple of routes and a couple of options in Reason. And we've got one of them is a dedicated stereo imager. And it's right here in our rack in the default mastering suite. And it's really simple to use. It's essentially 2 bands, and in each band you can either reduce or increase the stereo image. So the best plan really is to decide on a crossover point, and that's the point at which the bands are divided. And it's usually best to go for sort of the above the low mids, and enhance the higher frequencies and maybe make the lower frequencies more mono, or at least leave them untouched. The reason for this is low frequencies don't work so well when they're stereo. This is why kick drums and bass lines tend to work better in mono than in stereo. The same thing coming out of 2 speakers at once is generally more powerful than something different coming out of each speaker. Plus, you're not going to have any mono incompatibility issues or phase issues when things down there are just in mono. So let's take a look at how we can do it and how the stereo imager works, and then we'll look at a slightly different option. So I've already decided that I'm going to go for about 500 hertz or so. You don't have to be exact here because we can audition it in a second. And I'm going to make the lower end a little more mono and the high end a little bit more stereo. We're going to see from these little meters here what the stereo activity is. So let's play this back. Make sure it's not bypassed. And put it into normal mode. Now, if I put these both in original, we're going to see, and you'll see the active lights go off, we're going to see how much stereo info there is. So I'm going to go a little lower, actually. You see, as I go lower, there's less and less stereo info. So by turning this down to mono, we can really ensure that there's no stereo information below, say, 440 hertz. And there's already quite a lot of stereo info above this. I mean, you would expect that with this wide synth and the top end of the drums, but we can make it even more stereo if we want to. And if you want to hear exactly what is going on up there, you can solo it. And then we can solo the low band as well. So let's go a little lower. And then once you've auditioned the parts, go to normal. And if you want to bypass it, just flick the switch to hear the difference. And it's subtle, but it is apparent. And that's really the way to go with this. You don't want to push it too hard. You're going to get some very strange sounds if you do. And when it comes to mastering, as I said with the EQ and the compression, broad brush strokes, subtle changes. You're really looking at making a 5% enhancement here and nothing too extreme. Now, if this doesn't float your boat and you want to try something a little different, you can use reverb. It's not unheard of for mastering engineers to have a little reverb in their masters, and we can use the RV7000. I would suggest using it as an insert, but obviously have a subtle dry wet mix, and you're gonna opt for the favor the dry mix here. And really, we just want to use something maybe like an ambience. maybe like a room reverb. Let's go for something like this drum ambience. And this is just really to add some stereo image to the sound, you know? And just keep it subtle. Let's have a... Obviously too much is going to be too much. But a touch. And we can maybe, you know, enable the EQ. And the EQ here is already set to remove quite a lot of low end. I'm going to take this huge curve off the high mids. And that will add a bit of stereo image to your sound. If we take both of these off, you can hear that's a lot more mono. But the two together add a nice subtle stereo enhancement. And put the whole mix in a bit of a space. So there's two routes to adding stereo image to your master and stereo enhancement. And next up, we're going to take a look at limiting and creating a loud master, but hopefully retaining the dynamics. Before we finally export our master, we've really got one step of processing to perform, and that is brick wall limiting, or maximization as some people like to call it. And what we're doing here are really a couple of things. We're trying to boost the perceived volume, and this is achieved by reducing dynamic range. So really the same as a compressor, and ultimately a limiter is a compressor, just over a 10:1 ratio. And by reducing the dynamic range in such a way, we're increasing perceived volume, reducing the difference between the loud parts and the quiet parts of our track, and making the human ear think that it's louder than it really is. And another thing we're doing is putting a brick wall or a peak there that's very, very strict and won't allow the level to go over. And this ensures that we're not getting any clipping. And the two things hand in hand can produce really extreme effects, really extreme volume enhancing effects. So you've got to be pretty careful. With this more than most of the processes in your mastering chain, I've said all the way along, you've got to be quite careful, because you can end up coloring your mix with too much EQ, or you can end up making things not so compatible on mono systems with stereo enhancement, or make things sound a little crunchy with too much compression. But if you apply too much limiting or maximization, you can actually completely wreck the master and can reduce the dynamic range to a point where you're approaching white noise, and you really don't want this. So let's take a look at a few ways that you can ensure that you don't go over the top with this process, but you achieve a nice punchy full sound. So I've got the M-Class maximizer here at the very end of our chain, and I've bypassed the stereo enhancement, and I've just left some of the light EQ work that we've done and some of the light compression from the M-Class compressor. And we've also got the SSL bus compressor on the console. So let's take a look at what we've got here. Well, we've got a master output level here, which is going to be where you're going to be watching all the time. And I've got it in peak mode. I've also got the soft clip mode on and turned it down to 0. This just means that if you do get any clipping, it's not going to allow it to go over, but you're going to get like an analog clipping mode, much like a tape machine. So we'll get a nice analog warmth if things go over, but we won't actually get any overs. I also want the attack and release on, say, mid and slow or slow and slow. And the 4 milliseconds look ahead just ensures that there's no faults or overs coming up, but it will add a little latency. So don't have this applied if you're still tracking or adding instruments. Obviously we want this on because we want the limiter on, and then we want to start watching the gain reduction. And the gain reduction is applied by driving level into the limiter. And as we do so, you can see the gain reduction being applied just as you would in a compressor. and we can see the output level increasing. We're not getting any overs, but our dynamic range is being reduced. If I turn the limiter off or bypass the whole thing, in fact, let's keep it on but turn the level down so we can still see the dynamic range on the meter. You can see there's a lot more movement here. We're not getting up to 0, but there's a lot of movement. Let me get it into a part where the drums are. Okay. Again, as I start to drive level into the limiter, we get closer to 0 and I increase the pressure. Now if I push things too far, and let me up the output level on the compressor here, and we're getting to about 5 or 6 decibels of gain reduction here. You can see we're getting less and less movement up towards the top, until eventually you'll get next to no movement up around 10 to 12 dB. You can hear it sort of sounds like distortion, white noise, not very nice. So we want to watch our signal path and dial it right down until we're hitting the 0, but we've got about 2 or 3 decibels of gain reduction. Now there's no hard and fast rule here, but really 2 or 3 dB of gain reduction is enough. And you can get a good idea by taking a look at the big meter here. Like, we still want some movement up at the top, and we still want a couple of decibels of headroom. It doesn't matter if it's peaking at 0. If you want to take it slightly off 0, by the way, you can hit shift and bring the output ceiling or the output gain down to say 0.1. I'm just going to dial, you've got to be pretty careful, or 0.2. But just below 0 is fine, and then reset this and you'll ensure there's absolutely no clipping. For the minute I'm going to put it back onto 0. There we go. And I think that's probably still a little bit too much. We take it away, bypass it, you can hear the difference. We're gaining a lot of volume. Now, if you want to try something else, you can try a different maximizer now. There's a new limiter in town, and let's just select the maximizer here and create a new studio effects here. And it's the Ozone Maximizer. And this is from Isotope, and this is actually from the Ozone suite. Some of you may have used this, and it's got dithering built in. Now, I'm just going to use the actual dithering that's built into Reason, but if you like, you can dither here. So we've talked about dithering in the last chapter, but you can go down to 16-bit and you can choose your noise shaping, light, moderate, medium. You can choose the dither amount. And this is really great because it's pro quality dithering, and we can limit the peaks, harmonic suppress. I mean, there's plenty of options here. When talking about options, you can switch it on here, by the way, switch it on and off with this button. But talking about options, we've got a lot of options when it comes to the actual limiting. And we can have the margin set to 0.1, and that allows us to be just under the ceiling of 0. So it's a little bit more of a professional feeling sort of limiter. We've got a speed here. We've attack and release, both attack and release in the M-class maximizer, but this is an overall speed character knob and a stereo link. We're going to leave that on full link. And then we've got hard, soft, IRC1, IRC2. So you can play around with these different modes to see which mode you prefer, which sort of character you prefer. I tend to just leave it on the first mode. But then we can bring the threshold down, and this is really the main control. And we've got a much better metering system. Let me bypass this maximizer. And you can see that it's a bit more sensitive. So we're looking for about -2 to -3 dB. And I prefer the sound of this, you know. I think you can get more volume with less gain reduction. It's a little warmer to my ears, you know. Plus we've got more options, and I think the metering is slightly better. The gain reduction meter here, I'm not a huge fan of it. I wish that they'd make it, you know, a little longer. I much prefer this. It gives you a much better idea. And you can slow it down if you feel that the release is a little too fast. check the big meter. That sounds pretty good to me. So it's this sort of attention to detail when it comes to the final limiting that will allow you to get as much volume as you can out of your master, but at the same time, try and retain the dynamics and original character of the whole thing. So with that in mind and the whole mastering chain complete, let's have a think about how you're going to export it, how you're going to convert it into different formats, and how you're going to finally deliver the master. And that's what we'll look at in the next tutorial. Once you're happy with the way your master's sounding, you're ready to export and ready to deliver the final product. To do this, you've just got to run a final check and make sure there's no overs. And really, you want to ensure that you've got the endpoint here just after the file. And also that the left and right locators are in the right place and not cutting anything off. Once you're ready and once you've done this and once you've run your final check and made sure that your limiters are at the right point, and we did that in the last stage, you can either engage the dithering here or we can just go straight to export song as audio file. We can then choose a location and we can choose our format. Now you can go for audio interchange file format or WAV file. Now it doesn't really matter these days which one you use because most programs read both of them. But it is common courtesy to ask your mastering engineer or your duplication house or whoever you're sending the file to which format they'd prefer it in, because some people prefer it in one or the other. I tend to use audio interchange file format just because I come from an Apple background and this used to be an Apple specific file, and WAV used to be Windows specific. But really, it doesn't matter too much. They're going to sound the same. They're both uncompressed files. So once we're ready, we can call it export. And I'm just going to put it straight into the desktop. And this is where the dithering comes in. And we did look at dithering briefly at the end of the last chapter. And I'm going down to 16-bit here. So we want the dithering to be ticked. We can then export. And we can wait for this progress bar to finish. I'm not going to bore with it. I'll cut away and come back once it's done. Okay, so it's completed. We can now check out our file here, and I've got it to open in Soundtrack Pro, and let's just let it scan the file. There we go. We can see our limiting has worked. We've still got a decent amount of headroom. Let's play it back. Okay, that's good. We've got some good headroom going on here. We can see the meter in. We're not getting any overs. And now what we want to do really is trim the results. So let's just go ahead and zoom in, and I'm just going to trim off the start and finish. And I like to put a little zoom, a little fade, at the beginning of the section I've just zoomed in on. Maybe get a little closer. And this just means that you're going to go from 0, and it means no clicks and pops at the start of the file. You can do the same at the end. I'm going to chop off some of this reverb tail at the end of the track and put another fade out. Good, sounding pretty good. We've got a nice uniform level. Even the drums at the start are getting up to 0 dB with plenty of dynamics. And we can go ahead and save that. I'm just going to flatten the actions here. I mean, obviously, depending on the sample editor you're using here, this will change. And you could do this inside Reason if you really wanted to trim it right inside Reason. And once we're ready, we've got our final file here. And this can then be changed, turned into an MP3. I use Sound Converter, but you could pretty much use anything you want to. And you don't have to change it into MP3. It could be MP4. I mean, really anything that's going to be compressed and then ready to email or send on to somebody. Again, you want to ask the person at the destination. But I'm going to use a 320 MP3 here. And we're going to convert it straight onto the desktop. just let this complete. This is available at the App Store, by the way, Sound Converter. Great little app and gives you a lot of choices, as you can see, for formats that you can convert to. And once you're finished, we can check the playback. And there's our file that was completely mastered inside Reason. Sounding pretty good. I'm pretty happy with it. And there's proof that you really don't have to master outside of Reason at all. And you might need to use a few different applications at the end there to convert into the specific file types that you want to ready for delivery. But other than that, you can do everything from the start of the mix all the way through to the mastering and the export and the dithering right inside Reason. And your project can be finished to a really professional standard using just Reason and maybe a couple of little utilities right at the end of the process. I hope you've enjoyed the course. I hope it's helped you in your journey to mixing and mastering in Reason. Also check out my mixing and mastering toolboxes in Reason for a step-by-step process of mixing a different project. And hopefully you'll get some other tips from that. And I'll see you in the next course. Thanks very much.